Hey, welcome back to Road Tripping with Rachel. I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me as we are getting towards the end now of our study of the book of Nehemiah. We are going to be covering chapter 11 and 12 in just a couple of verses of 13 today. And since there's only 13 chapters in Nehemiah, that means we only have one more week than once we make it through today. But we are actually going to be talking today about how God is not a God of chaos. And what do I mean by this? So as we are going through Nehemiah, you'll notice that I'm really looking for principles that we see throughout the scriptures in the overarching story that is Nehemiah. And really in these two chapters and a bit of the third is that God is not chaotic. Sometimes life just becomes like that. There's a lot happening. There's like sickness, there's finance problems, there's children problems, there's spousal problems, relationship problems, work problems. And you look out the world and you see just kind of the show that it currently is. And it's very easy to think God's not in control, God's not doing anything. He's just letting everything go. There is a word for that. It's called deism. Where he's just that great watchmaker. You just wound it up and just let it go. But that really is not who God is. And as we go through these next chapters, we can really see when we take a little bit of a step back and we're looking at it from a broader perspective, we can see how involved God actually is and what he has done to preserve things and to bring order. God is not a God of chaos. God is very much a God of order. He is very much a God of logic. And we see a whole lot of that here in these chapters. So let's go on ahead and let's get into it. And just as a helpful reminder, I do actually also have a website, roadtrippingwithrachel.com. So if you want to do a little bit more in depth, I bring in a lot more scripture references normally in my blog posts, and I go into a little bit more detail than I do really here on these videos because I try to keep these videos a little bit shorter, but the blog posts are really easy to read. You see much more how I parse out my thoughts, and it's a good resource for you, as well as being able to go back and find different things, especially certain themes that I will be hitting on. Particularly one of my points here today, we are going to be hitting on it again later on in another study that we're going to be doing later on this year. So just some thoughts for you on that, but let's go ahead and get into Nehemiah 11, 12, and part of 13. So here, the first thing we really see is that God really ensures that people are where they need to be. When the Israelite people came back, there were people who chose to go on ahead and go back into their ancestral land so that way they could resettle a lot of the towns. Makes perfect sense. It's very logical. They couldn't all congregate in one particular city. That just invites a lot of problems, a lot of chaos. And remember that this was a small city that came back. So they needed to be able to spread out. They needed to be able to begin taking care of the land, doing food production, animal husbandry. They needed to begin to do all of that. So as part of that, there were people who they went to live actually in Jerusalem, which was where the, vast majority of the book of Nehemiah takes place, but there were also people who went out into the towns. And while they were there and they're working the land, they're building themselves up as a people. Now later on, we're going to see that they spent a little too much time outside of the city as far as building their own houses and things like that. Haggai has a lot of things to say about that during the construction of the temple. But as we are looking at this, we see that God put specific people in specific places because that is where they were going to be of the most use for him and the plan that he had for their lives. God is also very specific. Now we see this in verses 6, 8, 12, 13, 14, 18, that God really lists people by name. So we like to think that, oh, the idea that we want to be able to leave a legacy. I think this is something that you start to think about a lot more as you get older, but also as someone who has grown up in the 90s and 2000s, as a millennial, like the idea that I want to be able to leave the world a better place. It's very much part of like just my generation. And that really is something that's not really unique to the millennials. I think it's something that is very much a part of every generation that is ever going to be before me, and will likely also be a part of all the generations that come after me. But we want to be able to leave a legacy, and we want to be able to be remembered. We want to be able to do something that is going to keep us alive even after our bodies are gone. And that's, in a weird way, like that's really what God does here whenever he's giving like us all these genealogies. Now I will be the first person to stand up and say sometimes those genealogies, they're so boring. In part because I can't say most of the names. Like, I will willingly admit that. That's my own ignorance. I have a hard time with those names. But the fact that those names are recorded shows that there is a legacy that is being left with them, that they are remembered by God, that God chose to include them in his holy scriptures. He remembers them. He didn't allow them to just fade away. One of the things that I enjoy, just a little factoid, was that when I was in seminary and going through the book of Ruth, one of the things that my professor pointed out, which shout out Blake Hearson, one of the things that he pointed out was, in the book of Ruth, you get to the 4th chapter and you see where, sorry, my cat's playing on my bed. One of the things you really see is that with Ruth and Boaz, there was a man who was actually more closely related to Ruth than Boaz. And that man actually had the first rights to be the kinsman redeemer. And one of the things he says as to why he doesn't choose to be the redeemer is because I don't want to deny my children, like my name, my son, my posterity, having my name forgotten. And that man is not named in scripture. Boaz is. And that when you're trying to be remembered, sometimes you won't be. And it's the people who just want to do the right thing that get remembered. So God is specific. He remembers people. He remembers those who love him. He remembers those who don't. As we also see throughout scripture where people are named. But the fact that God saw fit to have their names written down, now not everyone, because there's been a lot of people that have lived, but the fact that God sees it, that here's their name, God remembers, and he's specific. He remembers your families. And he gives specific duties to specific people. There's a lot that goes into making up a person, into who they are, their experiences, their family groups, where they live at, their culture, the time that they're born. And yet God has this way of having each person, their unique makeup, makes them able to do very specific things. And sure, like having been in the workforce in the business world, I know that I'm replaceable as far as like an employee goes, but no one could ever actually replace me in the things that I can do, the unique talents and abilities that make up Rachel. Those are things that can't be replaced. And that's because no one else has ever lived my life exactly the way I have lived it, and who has had the experience that I have had that makes me unique to be able to do very certain things. And the same thing applies to scripture, that there were workmen and artisans and all these different people who were uniquely talented in what they were doing, that they were able to fulfill the roles that God had for them to be able to do. And it never would have happened if these people had not come to Jerusalem, or their family groups hadn't come to Jerusalem. or that they hadn't been born in Babylon at that time. They might never have developed some of these skills if they had never been born in exile. So God gifts you and gives you specific jobs and responsibilities that are unique to you. And this is a little bit about extra biblical things that take place. So we have the scriptures, that is what we go with. But the Hebrew people were also very good about just keeping track of history. Just as a whole, they kept track of things. So God has his people remembered. So even though you have a lot of people who are recorded in scripture, there was also the book of historical events, which is not part of canon. It's not part of our scriptures, but it is an extra biblical text where it records a lot of the events that took place as well and addresses additional people. So even when things aren't necessarily recorded in scripture, God has a way of still recording all of these different individuals. There are plenty of individuals that we know about who aren't exactly found in the Bible. We all know who Alexander the Great is. Now, he's not named in scripture, but we all know who he is. And we know that he was foretold in scripture. Thank you, Daniel. That is something that actually did happen. And I see this hair here that did not. I'm going to have to pin that. But also, because God is a God of logic and he's not going to be a God of chaos, he also gives us directions on how to worship him. Now, caveat, we're talking right now we are looking at the Old Testament. We get into the New Testament, we do see some different directives because in the Old Testament, Jesus hadn't come yet. So the sacrificial system was still in play. Post Jesus ascension, the sacrificial system is not necessary anymore. And so the way that we worship has changed. But that doesn't, not in total, but in part it has changed. So some of the things that just has not changed, because it's oh my gosh, we could have lessons about the sacrificial system and comparing the church to the temple, just going through all those comparisons. There's so much there. Maybe we'll end up doing that. My timeline ended up a little bit off when I planned all this out. Maybe that will be something that we do for a lesson, later on in the year. But God gives directions for worship of him. So one of the things that is, I guess I should say principles, that is the consistent and that is the same, is that we are all prepared to be in his presence whenever we go to worship him. So that means we are there with purpose. We're not checking out and thinking about the game that's on. We're not running through the arguments that we have with our spouses or our friends or our parents or whatever, which it's a natural thing to do. I totally understand. I do it. I shouldn't, but I do. So, but coming in with the attitude of worship and being prepared to be in God's presence is a part of worship, and that is a principle that carries on. And then there is order for how we are to worship him. So in the Old Testament, like I said, you had the sacrificial systems, you were bringing specific animals for specific sacrifices at specific times of the year. In today's world, Christians, we choose to meet on Sundays. Some churches will do a Saturday, or they might meet at a different time during the week. But, there is, the reading of scripture always takes place in a worship service. I will argue if there is not reading of scripture, you are not in a worship service. So there's always the reading of scripture. There is always prayer. Those are, I would say, probably two things that are always present when you have a corporate gathering of believers, just as the sacrificial system was